Hello, welcome to Interdependent Study, our podcast where we engage in the learning and unlearning work for collective liberation. I'm Aaron.
And I'm Damien. Thank you so much for joining us today. Each week, we bring something new to the table, discuss our thoughts and feelings about it through the lenses of who we are and where we can go for a more just society.
We want Interdependent Study to be a space where we're always learning with one another. And Damien is up this week.
Yes.
What are you bringing to the table today?
I have brought an article from In These Times to the table for us to talk about today. It is called For Labor, Caution is Fatal. It was written by Stephen Lerner, who is an experienced labor and community organizer who has helped workers from a variety of industries to organize unions and fight for better wages and better working conditions across the board. Specifically, he's served as a leader for both the Justice for Janitors campaign, which is mentioned in this piece, and the Bargaining for Common Good network. So it was really exciting to get to learn from him because he's got so much experience. This piece itself was all about the current moment that the labor movement is in right now and how the new administration will certainly present challenges and has presented challenges to the movement's progress and the existence of unions and the work that's necessary, but also how this administration provides an opportunity for, I think, inspiring action and resistance and being potential fuel for the fire and rationale for the labor movement's work and necessity, really. So to that point, part of Stephen's opening of this piece, I wanted to share that. It was great. It said, quote, "With the election of Trump and his billionaire backers, buddies, and beneficiaries, unions face potential annihilation as Trump shreds federal sector collective bargaining agreements and Elon Musk and other employers challenge the constitutionality of the National Labor Relations Board itself. At the same time, the country as a whole is more pro-union than at any time in a half century. And we can count on Trump and his cronies to make the best case in years for the need for a union resurgence as they cut taxes for themselves, siphon even greater wealth to the super rich, and cut budgets and services to our communities, thereby creating conditions that make a labor resurgence both more attractive and, as counterintuitive as it might sound in this fraught moment, more possible." Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I thought that was really great context for the rest of this piece and set it up very well. And I should also mention that Stephen Lerner does a really great job in this piece to provide, I think, some solid insight and analysis around the strategy that could be used by the labor movement to sort of lean into that potential fight that I talked about. So yeah, let me stop talking there. Let's get into this. What did you think of this piece?
Yeah, I thought this was a really clear call to action for labor not to shrink away under the weight of the Trump administration and their anti-union sentiment and actions that you mentioned above, and all of their billionaire buddies who are also really pursuing as much attack on the working class as they can.
Yeah.
And we should mention that this was written before Trump announced his attempt to revoke collective bargaining for federal employees.
Oh, that's right. Yes.
Which was just last week, I think, as we record this. So I think we'll see some stiff backlash to that, and that's already started. And one key thing that I think is important here is that we start to connect between labor and other freedom movements and borrow strategies across the different kinds of organizing that happens.
Yes.
And see how ultimately our freedom is interconnected.
Absolutely.
And we've talked about that before a few weeks ago with the piece from, I think In These Times, there was a panel talking about Palestine, and they were talking about how to connect labor to a free Palestine movement. And as we connect all those dots, we see how interconnected all of this is.
I love the through line of all of that. And it makes sense. Absolutely.
Yeah. And so I think he's connecting different dots, additional dots to how all of this works together.
Yes.
And so one of the things that I really appreciated, he said toward the beginning of this article, quote, "We need to drive a wedge between the elites by demonstrating through disruption of business as usual that attacking workers, immigrants, and people of color has a direct economic consequence. We need to make billionaires and corporations feel the pain that they are inflicting on all of us."
Yes.
And we've got a lot of work ahead of us to make sure that they feel that pain of the economic consequences of their actions. And they're already feeling some economic consequences, I think, but not related to labor yet.
Yep.
But I think that's gonna need to start soon. I think people are probably already talking about it.
Absolutely.
There's already talk about what 2028 looks like And as multiple contracts, union contracts come up for renegotiation that year and different things. So we'll see what that looks like, but I'm also interested what happens in the more short term.
Absolutely.
From there too.
Yeah, and I love the connection there with, disrupting business as usual and attacking workers and immigrants and people of color. I mean, so again, that through line of how connected we all are and sort of standing in solidarity with one another, all of these things are related. And so I love that. I'm glad you connected that to that other piece that we read, that panel discussion. And I agree, there's so much in this that is a strong call to action, which is important.
Yeah.
One of the things that I think Stephen does a really great job of in this piece is he shares how important the history of the labor movement is to the moment we're in now. And in particular, he highlights how labor can learn from the lessons from where it's been before and where we've been before. So he says, quote, "We can imagine the formidable struggles we will likely face in the months and years ahead by looking back in history. We only need to look as close to home as America's own segregated Jim Crow South, for example, to get a sense of how a racist, patriarchal, anti-union, and authoritarian regime can be constructed within the confines of a nation that calls itself a democracy governed by the rule of law." He then goes on to say, quote, "What we will find in these parallels is both deeply disturbing and surprisingly hopeful. As challenging as the current situation is, those who went before us faced much worse. Chattel slavery, laws that categorized union activity as a criminal conspiracy, strikes deemed illegal, racial and gender discrimination upheld by the highest courts, employers who hired mercenary armies to fight unions, the violent repression of labor agitators, Gilded Age plutocrats as brazen as Elon Musk in purchasing political power. The list goes on."
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think there's a lot to unpack in all of that and a lot of history to learn from. And I'd love to sort of do some of that work. But I think the larger point he's making with all of this is that, we're at this point again. I think at one point in the piece, he calls it a tipping point. And so there's a lot that labor can learn from history to help in this fight. And again, it speaks to that call to action that you were talking about. There's a lot to learn, but there's also a real serious call to action in his words here.
Yeah, and I think one of the lessons from the past that I really appreciated was this, quote, "In the pre-World War I era, unions defined themselves as fighting for industrial democracy, arguing you can't have democracy if you don't have a say in what happens where you work," which I don't think I've heard articulated quite like that before, which is kind of no surprise given the decades-long attack on labor that I've basically grown up in my whole life.
Yeah.
But it's such a simple, clear idea that makes a lot of sense. If you've got no say in what your conditions are at work, then that influences how you behave as a citizen of a country, of a government, and it shapes what you believe is possible. And so if you can't go to the bosses and demand safer conditions or better healthcare plans or higher wages, then that translates into a frame of mind that believes you can't influence the government either.
Right.
And that we can't demand the things we need, or we can't demand better services, or we can't demand anything. And so those things are self-reinforcing. And so I think it's such an important point that I appreciate as a lesson from the past of, this is one of the reasons why we need this, is because we also need to have a say in what happens in our workplaces, because it gives us practice for having a say in what happens in the government.
Absolutely. I love that you pulled that history there and that sort of added analysis there. Like I mentioned some of it, but that's a great drill down into his example there of pre-World War I era unions. And I think you're right, like that idea that we have to advocate for ourselves in every aspect of our lives, even in our personal relationships and whatnot. Yeah, if we can't do it at work, what might that mean for our ability to do that in the world we live in? I'm gesturing in the air like folks can see that. I love that. I think something that's related to that, maybe something else that I appreciated in this piece was this notion, and you kind of mentioned this a little bit, but how important it is to fight these corporations and ultra wealthy people where it hurts. And he uses Tesla as a case study, which is fitting. So he says, quote, "We then need to figure out how to make these actors pay a price. The Tesla takedown actions across the United States and protests in Europe demonstrate that even the world's richest man can be impacted by mass action. Tesla's stock price is down 53% this year. We need to ask, how do we cut off their capital? How do we mobilize unionized workers in these companies toward strikes that demand better conditions for themselves and for common good demands that benefit the broader community? And how do we organize non-union workers in them? We need to disrupt and isolate them, working to cut off pension fund investments and state and local subsidies. And we need to be ready to use nonviolent civil disobedience to maximize the impact. And I love the questions that he poses there. And I really appreciate the ideas there, because I think they are significant ways to make these corporations take the demands of unions and workers and the labor movement seriously.
Yeah, I think it's connection, right?
Yes.
It's connecting between what do we do at work and what is for the greater good.
Absolutely.
And what's the benefit beyond our workplaces. And I think that's making those connections, I think, is really important, as we've been talking about.
Absolutely. And again, the Tesla example is just one that, I mean, we're seeing it everywhere. I mean, there was a Tesla strike, or a mass action sort of near where a lot of my family lives, up in Baltimore.
Yeah.
And so I love that it is happening everywhere, and folks are fed up, and this is how we show them how we're fed up. Absolutely.
Yeah. And another thing I think is important here was a subtext. I think I didn't pick it up as overt in the article, but I think it's an important lesson that I'm taking from it. And so I see it as subtext. Other people may not.
Okay.
But I think we tend to romanticize or mystify the leaders and organizations of the past, which I think limits what lessons we learn from them, because we see them as these great people and we don't see them as regular people who did great things because they were well organized and they put in work.
Right.
And
I see what you're doing.
And I think we have to demystify them and understand that they were regular people and they did incredible things, but they did those things simply because they saw that something needs to be done.
Absolutely.
And we do this through selective memory of events. We think back to strikes and actions from a long time ago rather than looking to more recent history. And so Stephen uses some examples in this article that are more recent than, and juxtaposes them with things that are from longer time ago.
Okay, you're right.
And so instead of just looking to the Great Railroad Strike of 1877, we can learn from the Justice for Janitors campaign in the 90s.
That's right.
We don't just have to look to sit-down strike in Flint in 1937. We can look to Union for Everyone's demonstration at the Republic Windows and Doors factory that happened in 2008.
Right.
And we can learn a lot by looking back a long ways, but let's not lose sight of the things that have been happening more recently as well.
Absolutely.
Because we lose a lot of our history, we lose a lot of our ability to strategize and create tactics that work in a variety of places if we don't understand, because all of those people were doing their work based on what had come before them.
Right.
And so we can continue to build momentum in that way, at least in the development of how we pursue that democracy at work that we talked about, and making that connection between us as employees, us as workers, and then us also as citizens.
I really like that subtext.
Yeah.
I love that you picked that up. And
did you feel it wasn't overt necessarily, right? But
right.
It's in there.
But I appreciate that idea that, we romanticize our leaders because we see the big, amazing thing that they did. But at the end of the day, and with using this as an example, they were fed up workers, and they had conversations with their comrades, their fellow employees, and they said something's got to change. And they organized and they did it. And so that there's inspiration we can take from that, and we can all do that. What are the conditions and where, in which we're working right now? How are my friends at work feeling, and what are the conversations we're happening, and what ideas do folks have? I mean, there's lessons to learn from that, and it doesn't have to be this thing that we hold so high on a pedestal. I think it's unattainable.
I think about the March on Washington.
Yeah.
And we watched that Bayard Rustin documentary recently, and we saw a little bit of how they did all of that.
Yes.
And some of the work that went into all of that. And it was just regular logistics and event planning.
Absolutely.
That's what it was.
And I love that
it's such a giant historical event in our minds that I think it gets built up. It gets romanticized.
Yes.
And then we think like, well, yeah, like Bayard did it because it was amazing. Like he was an amazing organizer. Right. And not that he wasn't, he was.
Right.
But he was also doing things that lots of other people can do as
Absolutely.
well. Maybe not as well, but
Yeah.
they can do it.
Well, I love in that film that, that one of the women, talked about. He just called me up and asked me to do this. And I thought, can I do
He
this?
said, yeah, you're in charge of buses now, or
do
transportation
it.
or whatever.
And she did it,
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
And
yeah.
so I think that's brilliant, my friend. And I think that leads us nicely into application. So let's shift over to the application portion of our show. How does this piece and our conversation about it apply to our everyday lives and work? So my application connects really well to what you talked about earlier, I think. And that's just how important it is that we continue to resist and to fight for what's right. And I think that's especially the case with labor and the labor movement. And so one of the things that Stephen Lerner says in this piece is, quote, "Our goal can't be to just limit the damage, slow the hemorrhaging, and hope the Democrats get elected in 2026 and we can return to the slow and steady decline that the labor movement has faced under both parties. After all, labor continued to lose density under Biden with the most aggressively pro-union labor board in recent history. Returning to the status quo is both impossible and deeply undesirable. We can't fall into the trap of defending a failed system. We need to articulate a vision of a country and a world worth fighting for. Then we need to back that vision with resources, strategies, and tactics that make it possible for us to win." Mm-hmm. And I think, using your words, that's a great call to action. We can't go back. We have to push forward. And that has to be done in a way that's guided by a vision and a plan. And so to me, that was really great application from this piece and for the labor movement in the months and really years to come.
Yeah, that is really good application. Mine is about power.
Okay.
Because it's always about power in one way or another.
Yes.
So Stephen says, quote, "Part of SNCC's brilliance was their power structure analysis. Ella Baker, Bob Moses, and other leaders knew that to build and exercise power, you needed to focus on the corporation's local power players that politicians take their marching orders from. Mm-hmm. SNCC's research department looked at which corporations were profiting off segregation and propping up politicians. Then SNCC developed strategies and tactics to make these companies pay financial and reputational costs."
Yes.
So this kind of power analysis and understanding who controls what and what influence we have over those power brokers is vital to creating change to the conditions we're all struggling through.
Right.
I think Stephen said that it can't just be about surviving.
Right.
To a certain extent, I think the next little while it's just about surviving. But this kind of power analysis helps us figure that part out too, along the way.
Where we're going and what we need to do. Absolutely.
Yep.
And I'm so glad you brought up SNCC. I forgot to mention them, but they're another example that he provides in this piece and sort of uses in his analysis.
There's another place to learn from.
Absolutely.
Connecting to civil rights, Southern freedom movement work into what labor can do today.
Absolutely. Very good. All right. Well, let's move on to homework. What do we want to do to continue our learning and unlearning work once we leave this here table of ours? Yours, really. I'd like to look more into the history of the earliest versions of the manifestations of the American Union movement that Stephen Lerner talked about in this piece. He mentioned the Knights of Labor, which emerged in the 1860s, the American Federation of Labor, which began in the 1880s, and then the Congress of Industrial Organizations, or the CIO, which I had heard of, which came into existence back in the 1930s. And so I just want to sort of learn more about those organizations, those unions, and see what lessons I can take from their work and their efforts and, apply to our continued learning and the work that we're doing. What about you? What are you thinking for homework?
Well, my homework is directly connected to what I just talked about.
Okay.
So I want to learn more about the power analysis work that SNCC Research Department did.
Oh, yeah.
And how that might apply to the work that I'm doing in a variety of places. We so frequently avoid conversations about power, and lots of people, myself included sometimes, associate power with something negative because mostly power gets wielded in this negative way, particularly in the way that we've grown up to view who has power and who doesn't.
And authority and whatnot.
Yeah. Yep. So it's wielded by authority frequently as punishment or as holding something over you. It's got a negative connotation. It's bad people who have power. And I always feel like I'm in opposition to those people in power and that we're always fighting power, which isn't untrue, but it's only one piece of that conversation. And so I have to constantly remind myself of that. that having power and building power in an organization with regular people is the goal.
Yes,
too. So
absolutely.
To fight with that power that we don't have. And so, yeah, learning more about SNCC's structure, how they did the power mapping, feels like it would be very instructive, especially in the moment we find ourselves in.
Absolutely. How are we using power in ways that is for good?
Yes.
I think is the way to think about that. I love that. Very good. All right. Well, this was a great piece and a great conversation. Check it out again at In These Times if you are so interested. I learned a lot from it. I want to continue learning from it. But Aaron, my friend, you're up next time.
Yes.
What are you bringing to the table in our next episode?
I'm bringing the first episode of Eyes on the Prize 3.
Oh, nice.
Which is streaming on Max.
Yes.
We watched a couple years ago now.
Yeah.
I think Eyes on the Prize 2, which was a documentary, like a single documentary.
Yep.
And this is a 6-episode docuseries.
Love it.
And so it's described as, quote, inspired by Henry Hampton's legendary documentary series, Eyes on the Prize, America's Civil Rights Movement. This new installment illuminates the bold stories of people and communities who continue to work for equity and racial justice in the years since the birth of the American Civil Rights Movement. So we're going to watch the first episode. There are 6. And the description for the first episode is, quote, through the rise of Reaganomics and the AIDS crisis, communities in the South Bronx and Philadelphia fight for housing and health care. So I'm really excited to get into this.
Yes.
And I may be oversharing a little bit here, but I think we should watch this whole series this year.
I love that idea.
Because it goes from the rise of Reaganomics and the AIDS crisis, starts in like sort of 77 and goes up to 2015.
Yeah.
So we get the sort of first flashpoint post Ferguson of the development of Black Lives Matter and movement for Black Lives. And I think that Dream Defenders appear in there. So there's a lot of current movement organizations that pop up in that last episode too. And so that's the time that it spans.
Okay.
Right.
Fascinating.
Yeah. So we can see what happens, but I think that we'll be able to squeeze these episodes in. And, you know, in all honesty, I'm just excited to roast Reagan next week without having to shoehorn it in. I don't have to make any of these tenuous connections. We're literally going to talk about Reaganomics, and we can just roast him.
I love it. I love it.
Without any subtext. It would just, nope. This is a roast Ronald Reagan episode next week. Get ready.
All for it. No, I'm very excited. I saw a preview of this and it didn't even click to me to think like, oh, we should bring this for the podcast. I just saw it and I was like, oh my God, they've released a third part and it's a docuseries. How fun. Can't wait to watch it. So I'm so glad that you went the extra step to say we should bring this for the podcast.
I'm a thinker.
So, good. I'm excited to check that out. Very good. All right. Well, folks, with that, we want to thank you for joining us today. You know what we want you to do here, but in case you forgot, please follow, leave a rating and review, share our podcast with everyone you know. Follow us on social media, including Instagram, TikTok, and Blue Sky. Check us out on YouTube and sign up and join us on Patreon to get notified about any new things we've got going on behind the scenes.
Yes. Thank you so much for listening. And remember, it's not about us, but it is about all of us. And we'll talk to you next week.